David Dimbleby.
Tonight we're in Westminster, just by the Houses of Parliament. And welcome to Question Time. And on our panel tonight, the former GP, Defence Secretary, now Secretary of State for International Trade, the Brexit-loving Liam Fox, whose air miles seeking trade deals would so far have taken him to the moon, but not back yet. One of Labour's new MPs, elected last year, but already into a job as Shadow Minister for Labour, Laura Pidcock. Roma Agrawal, a structural engineer who worked on the Shard here in London, a campaigner for getting more women into engineering. George Mapanga, who grew up on a South London estate, turned from rapping to poetry when studying at Cambridge University, and now universally known as George the Poet. And the chef, restaurateur, writer, businesswoman, and judge on the Great British Bake Off, Prue Leith, known just for tonight as Prue the Cook. Thank you very much. As always, if you want to get engaged in the argument that's going on here in this hall, do so by using our hashtag BBCQT on Twitter or on Facebook. Let's have our first question, and it comes from Marcus Gray, please. Marcus.
If the incident in Salisbury is proven to have links to Russia, what action do we need to take?
Liam Fox.
Well, the first thing is that we mustn't jump to conclusions. Our thoughts should be with those who have suffered in the way that they have. It's a despicable crime. It's a ghastly thing to happen physically to you. It's clearly been a very brazen crime committed in our country. And it's worth pointing out that it's not easy to make nerve agents, so it's unlikely to be someone just operating as a backroom terrorist. So it's likely to be a much more preconceived attack, but it's impossible at this point to say. There is a police investigation, and in such important issues where there's so much at stake, it's all the more important that we wait until we've got information before we jump in.
Well, Boris Johnson didn't wait, did he? Boris Johnson said we should cancel the football cup.
No, he said, in fact, that we had to wait till the end of the police investigation to see what would...
But if Russia was involved, we'd have to consider that. And Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, said today, if Russia was involved, there are all kinds of things we should do. Well, the question, he says if. The question is, what action is there that can be taken or could be taken against Russia?
Well, if Russia was involved, clearly we could look at the sort of things that we did after the Litvinenko case, where people were expelled from the country, where we stopped our cooperation. We already have sanctions on Russia because of their behaviour elsewhere, because of their illegal annexation of the Crimea. You can always look to what's happening with that. But I make the point again, this is a very important issue. It's important to keep the temperature down until we actually know the facts. There's too much at stake.
But I would say that measured tone is actually quite damaging when you look at a system in which Putin's or the Kremlin has been able to pretty much run amok. And every time an incident like this comes up, there are these strong talks about sanctions and consequences. And he doesn't seem to bat an eyelid. And in honesty, if you look at the Litvinenko situation a while ago, sanctions only really followed, sanctions were only imposed following escalations, like you said, of their behavior elsewhere. And again, not much seemed to happen. So I think it doesn't create the greatest impression when you take a measured tone and the cynicism that sits within most of us is justified at a later stage.
But if we jump to...
I'll come back to it. Laura Pidcock.
I think that I do want to stay grounded and not speculate too much because, yes, nerve agent has been found, but there isn't a connection at this point in time. And I can understand the past that makes us assume it might be Russia, but I think we mustn't do that. I'm not going to do a Boris and, make policy up on the hoof and say that we should, not go to the World Cup or do this or do that. Actually, if it is found that Russia is involved, there needs to be really robust diplomatic conversations that take place. This idea that you just kind of bomb first and talk later. That is not a strategy that the Labour Party would employ. But we have to stay really, really grounded. There is something that the government could do. They could include financial sanctions in the money laundering bill against dirty money, against those who act against human rights violations in other countries. And they're not doing that now. You're not willing to do that now.
But part of the issue with that is that a lot of the time, the financial sanctions that are imposed are actually imposed on enemies of the Kremlin who are only here to wash their money. That's the first thing. And then secondly, if you look at Labour's track record as well, I remember just after the fiasco with Georgia, we had David Miliband expressing solidarity, in his words, with the Georgian people. And then later in the year, being in Russia, saying that that was just a discrepancy. I think he called it a respectful disagreement. So this is what I'm saying about that political speech. A lot of that flip-flopping, it doesn't really bode well in the long term.
Okay, the woman up there, in the third row from the back. Here.
It was stated on the news today that there are possibly another 14 similar incidents. Do the panel have any information on that? And I'm tending to agree with George.
Yes, I think that the Home Secretary, I think, referred to those other allegations, which BuzzFeed have got, 14 of them, yes. I don't think that you'll find information from anyone on this panel about it, because I don't think anybody has any information. But Prudley, what do you think about the question that was asked?
The only thing I'd like to add, because I pretty well agree with what's been said, is that it would be a great pity if we use sport to punish the Russians in this way, because sport should be the one area of human activity, if you like, that should be not politicized, because it's about pleasure and coming together, and it should be the thing that makes peace. So I would not like Boris's solution. I think we should have sanctions and fines, and
if they are found.
Would it be any punishment to withdraw football from British football from the World Cup? Really, for the Russians?
Well, no, but I think it wouldn't be much punishment. It would be a hollow gesture, and it would be damaging, because sport should not be politicized.
All right, the woman up there on the camera.
I'd be interested to understand the panel's views on the escalation routes. My perception is that the sanctions don't appear to be working. We obviously don't want to go to war either, and withdrawing from a football competition probably won't be very effective. But kind of Russia's running amok with all of their things that they're doing in Syria, ignoring UN votes, and this potential issue here. So there must be something other than sanctions.
Roma Agrawal.
Yes, so I can't really comment on in terms of sanctions and stuff, not being a politician, but I think in terms of this situation in Salisbury that we're looking at, I really think we need to let the police do their job and conclude their investigation. And I'm definitely not in favour of any knee-jerk reactions. And once we do have the results of that investigation forward, then we need to allow government to make the decision of what the right path is.
I suppose the question is there anything that can be done that would influence, one way or another, Putin's behaviour? Because, as I said, we've had sanctions after Crimea, we had Ukraine. It doesn't seem to have any effect at all on the Russian government.
I think the only thing that Mr. Putin understands is strength, which is why I think we've been right to put our tanks and troops and typhoons into Estonia, to make sure that Russia's border with NATO is secured. If you go to Estonia or you go to Poland, the world looks very different from what it looks in London. The threat looks very different. It's therefore essential that we maintain the integrity of NATO, that we maintain our defence spending, and it's necessary for Europe to do more. If you look inside the total NATO budget, the US population as a proportion of NATO is 35%. The contribution to the budget is 72%. The EU countries that are in NATO make up 52%, but only 24% of the NATO spending. European countries have to show commitment to their own defence. We've made that commitment in the UK by spending 2%, but European countries have to do more about continental Europe's defence.
I'll come to you, George. Yes, you, sir.
I think the main problem here when you talk about strength is we only have a 2% defence budget. And we're now talking about further cuts. I mean, surely that's not a show of strength, and we should actually be doing something more about that.
And strength doesn't always have to be military force. You know, it doesn't always have to be about aggressions towards other countries. I'm a firm believer in diplomatic solutions to
we know
these very,
because-
very tense situations.
Of course, Labour would leave us defenceless when they want to strap the last of China and things like that. So,
Just to be clear, yeah?
Well, I think it's just the most preposterous suggestion that, you know, the Labour Party would leave us without a British army. We are not the ones that are cutting the British army. We are not the ones that are leaving our soldiers
left us with a 39 billion deficit.
without the protection they need when they're overseas. So that's a complete myth and rumour that's
All
propagated.
right, the woman in green there.
So, former Foreign Office Minister said that opposition out of the EU has made us more vulnerable to attacks from the Kremlin and externally. How do we know that post-Brexit our safety is going to be safeguarded?
Outside Europe. I'll come to you. George, what do you think at that point?
I think the difficult truth is that as the public, we're not operating with enough information. For example, going back to what Liam just said about maintaining the defence budget and showing strength, that would imply that we have some sort of clout in the face of whatever Russia's been working on, you know, behind closed doors. And these are things that we have no idea about. So I feel like your feeling of insecurity is justified. And frankly, I don't think Liam's going to give you a straightforward answer to that question.
Okay. Is he? Well, hold on. Let me. You can give a straightforward answer in just a moment, but I want to go to the woman there in the middle. Yes, you.
Do we have any leadership that is strong enough to face off against Putin? And is it time to bring back Reagan-esque type leadership?
Well, you go on a little bit. What do you mean by that? What exactly?
Well, does either side, Labour or Conservative, feel that their leaders are strong enough to face off against Putin?
Liam Fox, last brief word. Then
Well,
we'll go on to
the question that I go back to is it's our collective strength. Our strength lies in acting together as NATO. We are the world's fourth biggest defence budget. We're the world's fourth biggest defence force. But we need partners to carry some of that burden with us. And we have to understand about Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin believes in two things that makes it impossible for him to be part of the normal family of nations. First of all, he believes in the concept of a near abroad, the old Soviet concept, that Russia should have control over its near neighbours and their economic and foreign and security policies. That's unacceptable to us. And secondly, he believes that the defence of Russian citizens lies in the Kremlin, not in the legal systems where they live. That is also unacceptable because it makes any country with Russian citizens in it vulnerable to Kremlin doctrine. We have got to understand that the Russian regime is a very dark and dangerous regime. It's very difficult to have the sort of diplomatic relations that we would want to have.
Dark and dangerous, you know, right?
Well, it is.
Nobody's
sorry,
condoning
but Russia is. I'm sorry, you can't be just out nice, Mr. Putin. There are dangers out there, and we have to face up to them. And you can't just deal with them with
And what about the Saudi Arabian regime? How would you describe that?
We may come to that, so let's not go down that road. But you were saying he was ratcheting
I just
what?
think tensions, essentially. I think that the question was about leadership and strength. I don't think strength is inextricably linked with military action. I think it takes strength to go in a room and be very strong about what your red lines are, whatever they are, without committing to military action. We are speculating here. We still don't know whether Russia was involved.
So we're speculating about Mr. Litvinenko. Go and tell him that you can be nice to Mr. Putin.
And that should be condemned.
All right, one more point from the man up there, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Thank you. If Russia is a dark and dangerous regime, will you be going and formulating a trade deal with them post-Brexit?
All right, we'll come to trade. We'll move on because we get to trade, and we might as well get there. Before we do, for those of you able to come to Dover next Thursday or Leeds the week after that, that's where Question Time is going to be, in Leeds with an audience all under 30 years old. On the screen, the details of how to apply, if you can pick that up, and I'll give them again at the end. OK, let's go to Trump and trade and Russia and trade. Warren Wint, let's have your question.
In light of Donald Trump's love of trade wars, will the UK come off badly in trade deals with the USA post-Brexit?
Yes, with Donald Trump's love of trade wars and the America First and the tariffs being imposed or proposed on iron, steel and aluminium, will we come off badly once we're outside the EU? I'm not going to come to you first, Liam Fox. I come to you, Laura.
I think that there are many things that worry me about trade agreements actually going outside of the European Union. First of all, that we actually don't know what is up for grabs. So it would worry me immensely if the NHS or our public services were up for grabs in trade deals, like a TTIP kind of situation. That would be a nightmare. And I think that's one of the reasons that the Labour Party has committed to a customs union. That actually that's about committing to jobs and protecting jobs. I think it's much harder when Donald Trump is suggesting 25% tariffs on steel. An industry, I represent a constituency that had a steelworks in concert, an industry that was already being decimated over many years. To imply that sanctions should be put on, it is very, very dangerous. There's 32,000 people's jobs at risk, and it is important that we are able to work collectively in the face of that kind of protectionism.
Does it suggest we'll get good trade deals outside the EU, to you?
If you take the Labour Party's position of having a customs union, I think it's much harder if you're outside of any agreement and you're having to work on your own. That's just common sense to me.
Praleef.
I think that Trump's little tweets don't matter. I'm not the person to talk about tweets, actually, but I'll risk it. I think he's already rode back a bit. He suddenly realized that 6% of all US steel comes from Canada. So he thinks, oh, okay, then he tweets again and says, I'll exempt Canada. So I don't think we should worry too much yet, because we never know how much he'll change his mind. But I think there's no reason at all why we shouldn't do good trade deals in or out of the EU. In fact, we've always, I think I'm about the only person who's old enough here to remember that there was a life before we were in the EU. And
How did you vote on the Brexit issue?
I ended up voting for Brexit, but I dithered and dithered because I think there are really good arguments on both sides, and there are really intelligent people on both sides, good people on both sides, which is such a pity that we have everybody fighting each other. We should stop re-fighting the referendum. Get behind the leader that the Tories, after all, they voted for Mrs. May. They should show some loyalty, help the poor woman get on and do the deal. And they can't, I think what we need is her doing the best she can, which I think she's a strong woman and I think she could do it well, and everybody else pulling with her. And we're going down Brexit road, so could we all just agree to make it work? Apparently not.
So have you been on to the Americans to ask them what the hell they're on about with this tariff they're imposing or suggesting imposing?
Literally, as you speak, the United States is making the announcement about what they intend to do over tariffs. And I've spoken to them several times over the last few days. And in fact, I'm going to Washington next week to take the discussions further.
And what is it they're saying, literally, as we speak?
Well, we don't know, David, because we're in here and they're out there.
And you don't know what they're going to say? You say you don't know what they're going to say?
No, I don't
You've
know.
had no
exactly,
assurances?
I don't know exactly what they're going to say, but it's clear that there's going to be some form of tariff potentially being introduced. Now, there is clearly a problem in steel in the world. There's an overproduction, largely coming from China. There's also what's called transshipment. Countries in Central America, for example, with no steel industries, are suddenly selling steel into the United States. And if we want a rules-based trading system, we have to make sure the rules are obeyed. But the way that the United States is going about this is wrong, because they're doing it under what's called a 232 investigation based on national security. And for the UK, it's doubly absurd, because we are only responsible for 1% of America's steel imports. It's 5% of our tonnage by steel that we produce here. It's 15% by value. The reason there's a difference is that we tend to produce very high-value steel, some of which can't be sourced in the United States, and will simply push up the price of steel there. We also make steel for the American military program. So it's doubly absurd that we should then be caught on an investigation on national security. So our view is, yes, we can deal multilaterally with the overproduction of steel, but this is the wrong way to go about it. Protectionism, tariffs never really work. And if you think about it, there are 140,000 American steel workers. There are 6.5 million people in America work in steel-related industries. For the prices to go up of steel, their input prices, makes no sense in the long term.
So, will we be exempt?
Well, we'll have to wait to see what the announcements are, or wait to see whether there's a time for negotiation. And that's why I'm going to Washington next week.
Okay. George?
I think part of the challenge with Mr. Trump's announcements is that it, like a lot of what he says, changes the atmosphere, changes the climate on the global stage. So when you had that reaction from Europe listing all of the things that will now have extra duties slapped on them from the American side, again, that changes the rhetoric. Now we are in danger of a trade war, and just perfect timing with Brexit, we will be caught in the middle of that. And again, to speak to the earlier point about political speaking over, downplaying people's concerns, I think that feeds the disconnect that there might be between politicians and many members of the public who feel justifiably concerned.
Okay.
So I completely agree that I feel very underinformed about this situation. I don't know how easy it is for Trump just to slap these percentages on. I don't think that trade protectionism works. And I think what the UK actually does very well, I use a lot of steel in my job, is that we have high-quality scientists, we have best engineering in the world, and what we should be doing is differentiating our product by using innovation, by using technology, make it the greenest steel, the strongest steel, the best steel, so that we are differentiating ourselves on that basis.
We do. Okay. All right. Well, you, sir.
Just on that point, I actually think getting out of the EU obviously enhances our opportunity, and when we consider and kind of paint Donald Trump as some kind of protectionist, we have to consider that the EU is a protectionist bloc. It has a common external tariff around it, in which it imposes tariff barriers on other nations, and so we'd have enhanced opportunities outside the EU, and so really we shouldn't be too concerned over Donald Trump, especially as he has reaffirmed on multiple occasions that he wants a special trade deal with us.
On that point, it speaks to what Prue said earlier about our ability to rally around one leader. Currently, and again, to another point that Prue raised, there was a life before the EU, but right now there's going to be a life after the EU, and that's going to be very different. So if you look at our standing on the world stage, I think Britain needs to have a very honest conversation with itself about who our friends are and what authority we will be able to call on in a time when we are literally outside of that protectionist bloc that we talked
George,
about.
I don't know whether you agree. I think it's also about the political motivations behind leaving the EU. So I am immensely worried about a life beyond the EU under the Tories. I understand why people voted to leave the European Union. I represent a Leave constituency, but you have to understand that the likes of, Liam Fox, Boris Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, they are hard-right conservatives who do like the idea that the free market rules and actually that workers' rights will be decimated if they get their way. And that's why there's a whole set of pre-negotiations that has to go on before David Davis can go off and negotiate with the European Union. It's free market ideology, and actually I think there needs to be a robust protection of workers' rights outside of the European Union, or everybody's living standards.
No one has suggested anything else. This is nonsense.
Sorry.
No, let him speak. Let him answer.
First of all, free trade globally is the way that we have taken, in 25 years, 1 billion people out of abject poverty around the world, allowing them to get access to our markets. The idea that we, one of the world's most developed countries, having had all those benefits, would pull up the drawbridge behind us and operate some protectionist policy would be totally
You're telling half the story. You're telling half the story. Free trade goes both ways. So it's not only it's not only the case that poorer countries are able to involve themselves in our market in ways that they have access to our technology. There's also the question of IP rights, which blocks a lot of what these poorer countries are able to do, and also our involvement, the involvement of richer nations in poorer countries that is able to siphon off the best of their resources and their talents. So what you're saying is half the story.
Are you, hold on, Liam Fox, are you've always been, are you still as optimistic as you were when you said it should be the simplest deal in the history of mankind? When we, there'd be deals ready on the March next year.
If you look at the EU negotiation, most negotiations in the world come from different positions where you're trying to make it closer. The EU comes from an identical position. And what we should be able to do is come to an agreement that it's mutually beneficial to have a zero-tariff, open, liberal relationship with the European Union. Now, just a second. Some of the things that Laura said are just plain wrong. The idea that you can be in a customs union and still have free trade agreements. If you're in a customs union, you are restricted as to what you can offer a potential trading partner. And what is even worse, coming from the left, this idea that they hate TTIP, but they want to be in a customs union. If you're in a customs union with the EU and then they agree TTIP, you'll have it imposed on you, whether you want it or not. It is a complete nonsense.
Let me respond. Because this is coming from a man who said it was too difficult to sack people, who said that actually employment rights were a hindrance to the economy. So my deepest fear post the European Union is a hard right conservative government that will be presiding over workers' rights
Theresa
in
May's
perfect
a hard
condition.
right conservative government.
But she's not ruling the
Conservatives.
She's not ruling the Tory party at the minute, is she? Is she?
The woman up on the gangway there. Yeah.
I have a question for Laura, and that is, what exactly do you think, which employment rights do you think are going to be decimated, and what evidence do you have?
Well, I've just said there that in the past Liam Fox has talked about employment rights being a hindrance to the economy, that actually it's too difficult and kind of there's a lot of bureaucracy to sack people. My experience of being a worker not that long ago and having many friends who are workers is that it's actually it's the opposite. Trade union rights have been decimated under this government. The Trade Union Act was a pernicious piece of legislation that prevents people from having control in their workplace to organise and have their own say. If we're talking about sovereignty and if we're talking about protections in the workplace, the greatest protection you can have is to be in a trade union, and the Trade Union Act was a piece of legislation.
You're now going back
to
into the
prevent
past.
that.
You were talking about what will happen when we leave the EU. You think that's going to continue?
It's
for you. It's a kind of
it's a continuation. We have to understand that on leave and remain there are hold on a minute. There are different political motivations, and all I'm saying is the hard right of the Conservatives want us to be out of the European Union to have a free market.
You've made your
and
point.
decimate
Let Fox
workers'
make
rights.
his point. Then I'll come to you over there.
We've just been taking through Parliament the European Union Withdrawal Bill, which actually would write into British law all the rights that workers currently have under the European Union. The Labour Party voted against it.
Absolutely.
You voted against it.
That's historical revisionism if I've ever heard it.
You voted against it.
Powers into the hands of ministers, not the people.
The woman there on the left, my left.
I think what concerns me more than anything else is the fact that both of you have been voted in to represent us as a country, and you're both arguing with each other. Brexit is not a party ideal. People who voted for Brexit are not necessarily Conservative. People who voted for Brexit are not necessarily Labour supporters. We are part of a country, and it amazes me that Labour and Conservatives cannot come together and actually agree what the best solution is for us as a country and move forward. Because at the end of the day, it's our children who are going to have to deal with this.
All right. And you over there.
Question for Liam. I agree with Prue. I'm confident in our ability to, negotiate these fantastic free trade agreements, but at what cost? So, for example, when Theresa May visited India, they said absolutely want to do business with you, but the concession was that they wanted free movement of their workers. And obviously, how far would you go? Would that be a red line?
All right. Let's have and the person here in the third row, yes.
Yeah, I don't believe we can trust the Tories. I think there should be a general election before a trade deal.
Okay. And in the second row there, you.
I am personally most concerned of all about the people in abject poverty that Liam Fox mentioned. There are people on this planet who are born into conditions that none of us will ever have to experience, far worse than we could imagine, and they have no way of getting themselves out of that poverty themselves unless our government and other governments obviously think about those people in the process of trade deals and try to fight against the terrible exploitation of the people who provide our sugar and cocoa for making cakes and such like. I really want our politicians to think about those people who don't have a voice and are really suffering because of centuries of unfair trade.
Do you think that's better? Do you think that's better achieved inside the EU or outside?
I personally really don't know, which is why I didn't vote in the end of the referendum. I think I want to trust that politicians care about human beings, not only British votes.
Okay.
I'd just like to pick up
Yes.
what the lady at the back said about the, coming together as a country, because I too am completely fed up of just watching politicians. We hear hard Brexit, soft Brexit. We'll have sunny side up Brexit next. I don't know what we're going to hear. And what I really want to see is a vision from both of the big parties in our country telling me why my life is going to be better outside the European Union, and I am absolutely not convinced at this point in time.
All right, and you, sir? Yeah. Yes, no, no.
We need to do what's right for our industries. We have fantastic agriculture industry. We have a fantastic automotive industry. And I think some of the things that we're talking about aren't necessarily going to secure jobs, drive the economy in those areas. All countries always trade most closely with their neighbours, and I think we need to think about what will do that. The Customs Union absolutely guarantees that we safeguard those jobs in those industries that are closest to us.
Okay. Well, we're halfway through our time this evening, so I think we'll move on to another question. Diane Pace, let's have your question, please.
Should the government learn from our European partners and take back control of the rented sector in housing?
Should the government learn from our European partners and take back control of the rental, or take control of the rented sector? And, of course, housing has been on the agenda this week. George, what's your view about that?
Well, the renting sector is an interesting question. There is the view that the youth quake in the last election is actually attributable to the issue of rent. That raises an interesting quandary in that the number of people that are really hard done by this current housing market is now at a critical mass where it makes a difference to an election. But at the same time, is it big enough for the Tories to care, like all the time, and not just before an election? I don't think it is. I do think the housing market, especially where we are here in London, is out of control. The private rental market, and it would be good to see some intervention. But
what did you make of what the Prime Minister said this week, that young people were right to be angry about housing? Those were her words in the House of Commons.
Yes, it's another one of her beautiful truisms. Of course, young people are right to be angry about it, but the question is what's actually going to be done. And promising planning permissions is not tantamount to actually taking control of the situation. So,
Diane Pace, you asked this question. What's the drift? What's the drift of your thinking on it?
Well, I was thinking particularly about what happens in the rest of Europe. Even though we may be leaving the EU, other countries in Europe don't see housing in the rented sector or even owner-occupation as about an asset. They see housing as about people's homes where they can make a life, bring up their families, work and enjoy themselves. In this country, we see housing as an asset, which means that everybody's scrabbling to get on a housing ladder, which is only about ownership, whereas the private rented sector or the public, or what I would support much more, is a mass council house building programme. But if we have it's not really about tenure, it's about providing a housing supply which is fair and regulated.
Having a home, in other words.
Having a home. And in the rest of Europe, that isn't contentious. In the Netherlands, which I know something about, it's the government that sets how high rents can be or how much rents can be raised a year. And I don't think anyone in the Netherlands is, or France or Germany, they're not rabid communists or socialists even. They believe that their housing sector needs regulation and landlords make money and people live in decent homes.
Brilliant.
I think that you have made a really interesting and good point, because I do think that we've come to the point when we have to consider doing something that makes the rental market work better than it does. And up till now, in fact, we've been it's worked very well, especially for the middle classes, because owning your own house was a little nest egg, and you stayed in it as long as you needed to, and then when you retired, you had the value of your house, and your children could inherit and all the rest of it. We're now living so long that our children won't inherit until we've spent all the money on healthcare or whatever.
That's your plan, is it?
That's my plan. Absolutely my plan. And so the nest egg thing, we've always been told, governments have told us, you know, and particularly, I admit, but particularly the Tories have told us that owning your own house is the secret to everything. It makes you feel secure, and an Englishman's home is his castle and all that stuff. But I don't think it'll work anymore because prices are so out of control. And I think there's the only problem with the European thing is that there is a real habit of saving in Europe. Everybody saves for their old age, the pensions are very good, and the national insurance, or their equivalent of national insurance, is very good. We don't have any of those supports in this country, so we don't have a culture of saving, except in the nest egg bit, which was your house. You put your money into your house. So you have to change a whole culture if you want to do that, and I think you might, in the end, have to regulate the housing, the rental market.
Let's hear from one or two members of our audience. You in the middle there. Yes.
I'm a filmmaker from Hackney, and literally I've done a documentary about gentrification, and I've seen my area completely change. It's not fair. Communities have been broken up, and in terms of like rental, it has just become the wild, wild west. It's unfair to see, you know, how you have to be affluent to live in a particular area, and it has priced people out. So I really do think it's unfair, and I think there needs to be something done about it because we are breaking up communities and people are moving out, and it's not fair.
Roma.
I think that the fundamental underlying problem under all of this is that we are not building enough housing in this country.
Come on.
So what we need to do, so I work in the sector, we need to get the private developers working with housing associations that provide affordable housing. We need to get local and national government tied up. We need to pull it out of this 5-year election cycle. We need to be thinking about homes in 10, 15 and 30 years' time, which will cause us disruption with construction in the short term, but we have to build enough housing. So until we don't get that joined up leadership, we need to then, and also just to add, with the housing has to come education, infrastructure, transport, healthcare, arts and culture. And so to do that, we have to come together. And I think the Olympic Park is one example where, you know, it worked well for some people, it might not be absolutely perfect, but it is an area where we did remediate wasteland, we brought housing there, we brought arts, culture, education, and it could be something that we use as a model to try and move forward.
But Roma, what do you make of the fundamental point that the questioner, Diane Pace, made, that we should move away, and that Prue Leith made, that we should move away from the idea of owning a house, to the idea that houses are provided and you rent them?
So I think it is quite a cultural thing in the UK. So I've lived most of my life here, but not all of it. And it's definitely something that I've seen as quite a UK cultural thing. I think if we do provide enough housing and people feel secure in rent so that they're not going to be kicked out in a few months' time, they feel they could live there long term and they have that security, then slowly perhaps that culture will change.
You're not looking convinced.
You have new developments that have come in Hackney. The fact that, you know, as a developer, you're meant to have a certain percentage for social housing. That is getting less and less and less. When you look at those houses, it's meant to be 20%. It's less and less and less. In fact, the gentleman right next to me is telling me that there are 2 different entrances. There's entrances for social and there's entrances for people who are on private.
So I disagree with that shouldn't happen, and we need to make sure that our councils are providing the mandated amount of housing. The problem is at the moment is that the councils, the government, have different ideas. Any council can make a decision of what they want, and then it depends on them, and we have to make sure that that regulation is robust.
All right. Liam Fox.
Roma's exactly right. It should be up to people themselves whether they decide to rent or buy, but that is dependent upon prices being accessible to far more people. And the problem is, if you don't build enough homes, but the demand is still there, the price will rise. We've got to build lots more homes to ensure that the prices are reasonable. And the good news is that last year, 2017, we built more homes, 1.1 million, than in all but one of the last 30 years. But we are a long way behind the curve, and we have to build lots more.
Do you believe in what Sajid Javid said, that 50 billion should be spent by government and councils should be free to spend? Because at the moment, councils, we're told now, 1 in 10 is going broke or more because they can't raise the money. Why aren't they free to do it?
Well, we've got one of the big problems that we face is that at the moment, if you're a house builder, you can apply for planning permission. And before you build the houses that you're actually contracted to do, you can get more planning permission. What we need to have is something called build-out. In other words, until house builders have actually built the houses they're contracted to build, they shouldn't be allowed to get further planning permissions. That would ensure that when planning permission is given by a local authority, the houses actually get built, rather than land banks being built up, or waiting till the house prices
sorry,
rise.
not to labour the point, but why can't councils be freed to borrow money at low interest rates that exist at the moment and build council houses as they did in the past? I'll bring in. What's your answer?
We've actually seen more council houses built in the last 7 years
It's not an answer
than in the
to
whole
the
previous
question.
13 under Labour. The question is, yes, it's all very well local authorities being able to borrow, but they have to pay the money back, and that has to ultimately be guaranteed by central government. So, yes, let's have the more freedom, but let's have it responsibly so that the taxpayer is not landed with yet more debt.
OK, I'll just pick up how I come to the man over there in the spectacles, yes, at the very back.
I think it's important to kind of note that we've stripped away over the past 30 years so much social housing, which has now been placed into the private rental market. It wouldn't be unusual in London to find, and probably most big cities across the UK, to find that people are living in what used to be socially rented properties that were bought by right to buy. They are put onto the private rental market, and you would be paying double on the private market for the same property that your neighbour would be renting from a council. So we need to stop assuming that private developers can provide the housing that we need. It needs to be done on a major scale.
All right.
And the model of social housing has to come back.
OK, Laura, I'll come to you in a moment. To take one more point to the man there on the spectacles on the, there.
Isn't part of the problem here in London? There are thousands and thousands of flats lying vacant which are owned by non-UK investors.
OK. Laura.
Well, there were people this winter, only a few weeks ago, that died on the streets because they did not have a home to call their own. And I think that is an absolute condemnation of this nation. That actually I heard this homeless man saying, you know, I just hope I wake up. Now, that is an absolute shame, and it's systemic. So in the private rented sector, rents are too high, people are getting in debt because their rent is extortionate, they don't have security of tenure. We desperately need council housing. And I just want to make this point, David, right? There's a reluctance to talk about council houses and to allow councils the freedom to build council houses. And there are ideological motives behind it. Everything has a political motivation behind it. That's what politics is about. If you are really secure in your home, if you have really low rents, if you have security of tenure, you're much less likely to take industrial action. Sorry, you're much more likely to take industrial action than if you've, say, got a mortgage and you're really, really worried about the security of your home. And I think that actually being secure in a house is a human right, and we have to start looking at it through a human rights perspective rather than just seeing it as a commodity or an asset or something that we can, you know, float on the stock market or whatever it is and bank lots of houses in London. People deserve homes as a human right, and you have to start talking about mass programmes of council house building.
OK. Got to the point. And just to pick you up on one thing you said, every political decision has a political motive, implying there was an ulterior motive or a different motive. What is Labour's different motive when it talks the way you just did?
that housing is a human right. It's not like a commodity,
So
essentially.
you don't have a political motive?
Well, no, of course.
Voters
Yeah.
voting Labour, anything like that?
Not in the crude kind of callous sense, because actually, contrary to popular belief, I genuinely do want people in my constituency not to have to come to me because they've got mould in their house, because they can't get to sleep and their children's health is exacerbated by poor living standards. I genuinely want people to be taken off the housing list, and I want council houses to be built, and I want them to be desirable and not kind of bargain basement properties, because housing revenue accounts have been slashed so much under this government.
Laura, we all agree with you. You can stop.
Not while there's people. I'm not going to stop while there's people dying on the streets. And we
Oh,
saw
for
what
heaven's sake,
we
Laura,
saw what
stop.
deregulation did.
Right.
Let me say this as a
No,
final
Laura,
point.
no, you have said your final bit for the moment.
What deregulation did Grenfell, though, David? Look what
no, sorry, let
deregulation
Prulith
did
speak.
there.
She was just taking you to task. for
No,
what she said.
no, I was just saying, you know, we've got it, and we agree with you pretty well. So, you know, let's let a few other people speak. But all I wanted to say was that I don't think this is a question of the rented market against the private, social market or anything else. I think it's got to be a mixed solution, and everybody has to do their bit. The only thing I'd like to say, which is rather a sort of obvious thing, but you know, we think that the housing problem is all because the politicians won't build houses. But we could do three things about that. I mean, we can't. The things that stop the houses being built is not the lack of money. It's that the planning procedure is very slow and difficult, and it's basically protectionist. They really, most planners don't want to build houses. They want to stop houses being built. And so that's one thing. The planning, I really think planning, the whole planning thing needs to be looked at very carefully and made much more cooperative and useful to builders. I also think that we should understand that actually, even if we could build the houses that your government have said we should be building this year, we'll never build them because there's not enough building materials to be had in this country, and it's too expensive to import it all. And there isn't enough labour, so there's not enough labour to build them, there's not enough materials to build them, and the planning... No,
right.
it's not.
Okay, the woman in the front here. Let's hear from you.
First of all, Prue, I'm a planner and I really want to see houses built because I'm also a young
Good
person
for
who
you.
doesn't benefit from the bank of mum and dad. So at the moment, I have no chance of buying a house before I'm about 40. Secondly, as I say, I'm a planner and a property developer, so I know quite a bit about the planning process. And my view is that the bureaucracy of the process is so complicated now, it takes years to put through a simple development of 10 houses. Can we not just simplify the whole thing and get it so that houses are being built in the areas that we want them to be built?
Okay, and the man up there on the gangway there, and then I come to you. Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I have a bit of experience in this because I live in London. I come from Yorkshire. I was able, fortunately, to buy a house with the support of my family. When I moved here, we worked with local projects to be able to rent the house out to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get into their own property and wouldn't be able to afford it. Unfortunately, funding for those kind of schemes has been cut, so we're not able to do that anymore. But I think Laura's point of give everybody who is homeless a free house doesn't really work. What happens for everybody else who has to earn their way into a house? What we need to do is take people on the streets and give them a route to be able to afford their own house, not give them a freebie.
Yeah, but they're interconnected, aren't they?
All right.
They're interconnected.
The person in the back row there, the woman second from the back, yes, you.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what George said about the youthquake. I really don't think it did enough to influence the election, even though I would have liked it to. I'm 18 and I have friends who are paying over $3.15 a week in rent to live in London, and you cannot have a generation of renters. It's just financial insecurity for life. When are the Conservatives going to take notice of an entire future generation who are facing financial insecurity?
You want to answer that, please? Briefly, Liam.
Well, that is the whole point of the government's housing policy now, that we want to build more. We, for years and years and years, including, it has to be said, you know, during the last Labour government, I'm interested why this one would be different, we did not build enough homes. The population has increased far more than the supply of housing. When that happens, you get a supply and demand mismatch, and then prices will inevitably rise. That's what happens when the market is distorted in the way that it is at the moment.
What your government still falls short of doing is compelling developers to stick to the social provisions that they are nominally committed to.
Okay, we've got under 10 minutes left. Take one more point from the woman there, on the gangway there. Just a brief point.
Just very briefly, the whole talk about building new houses, that's all well and good, but the problem is that there are people who buy bulk houses for investment purposes. I'm 40 years old, I pay more in rent for one room in a shared house than my brother does for a 3-bed semi-detached in Swindon. It's ridiculous because people will just buy them and they tell you, well, my retirement is sorted because I've got 5 properties and, I rented them out, so I'm okay when I grow old. So there are people just, whatever you're building, you've got people who are investing and just hoarding all the properties for themselves and not allowing it, so then that hikes the prices even more.
Okay. I want to go on. There are a lot of hands up here about that topic, but I want to go on because we've got another 6-7 minutes only to go, and this is an appropriate question for today. Perhaps Claire Carter, can we have it?
Do we want women reaching the top by merit or simply making up the numbers?
I.e. positive discrimination or merit, is that your point? When making up the numbers,
we're led to believe that we want more women on the director boards and directors, but surely it has to be on merit, because otherwise you discredit men and women.
Okay, well, Prue Leith has sat on many a board. Is it on merit or because you were a woman?
Well, to be honest, when the first public board that I ever sat on was the British Railways Board, and then I sat on various other ones like Safeway and Whitbread and so on. And I have to admit that probably the chairman who put me on those boards did it because they were tired of going to AGMs and some woman standing up, a shareholder, and saying, why am I looking at all these grey suits? Why aren't there any women on the board? So I was there as the token woman. But my attitude was always, I don't care what your motivation is, as long as when I get there, I'm allowed to do the job. And so I would, in a sense, what I'm saying is that I would happily back a quota system as long as it wasn't ridiculous. You don't want people who are not qualified for the job, but believe me, there are enough good women and well-educated women in this country to do almost any job.
Yes.
Basically, I'm absolutely behind targets and quotas and anything that will get women towards, because very quickly what happens is they start to realize, oh gosh, they're rather good at this job. And then the only trouble is they still don't pay them as much as men, which is wrong and illegal, but it happens.
Okay.
So I'm one of less than 10% of female engineers in this country. And it's very, very necessary that we get more women into my profession, because what engineers do is design for society, and if we don't represent society, then we're not going to do well for society. So it's very interesting for me that I think the reason at the moment why women aren't getting to the top in the numbers and the quantities that we should be is because the way we measure achievement is perhaps out of date. So we reward behaviors such as working really long hours, traveling a lot, there may be deals made on the golf courses, and so on. So what we need to do is to find a different system by which we measure what success is, what leadership is. And as somebody who works part-time, for example, I would love to see women that are working part-time still able to get to the top without having to, pull every hours and miss everything that's going on with their families. So for me, it's about changing that system.
Claire, let me just go back to Claire Carter, who asked this question. When you asked, do we want women reaching the top by merit, which presumably is the long-term aim, or making up the numbers, what's your view? Do you think, as Prue said, having women on boards statutory, making equal men and women in itself is a good thing?
No, I don't. I think all the women here, I speak for myself, maybe the women on the panel here, have been there by achievement and merit. You can't say you need 5 men and 5 women because you discredit the men. And would anybody like a job out of just a number without...
without
Hang on,
earning
George.
to a
Laura,
place.
Laura,
And we're
Laura
in
Pitt-
danger of
Right.
mixing this up.
You think there is a danger of this happening?
Yes, I do.
Laura-
I think
Laura
there's a
Pidcock.
massive danger of discrediting.
I think positive action is an acknowledgement of the structural barriers that take place to exclude people from systems, be it from politics, from the boardroom or whatever. And actually, just a very local, you know, the Labour Party has 45% of MPs are women because they took decisive action. I was selected on an all-woman shortlist. I got there by merit, I'm telling you now. It wasn't because I was just put up, I was put up against a pool of very, very capable women, I have to say. I just want to make one last point though, David, and that's that we are obsessed with the top, it seems. The biggest barrier in life to any kind of achievement is your socio-economic status, so what class you are, and how you achieve is very much about what opportunities are afforded to you. So I'm less concerned with the boardroom and I'm more concerned with how much the lowest paid workers are being treated in this country.
Good.
Just to echo much of what Laura said, I think the first step is a psychological acknowledgement that there is a deficit or an inherent bias within society. And I think what things like quotas and positive discrimination schemes allow is for a moment to depart from the automatic thinking that we might just slip into. And I think the benefit of that is that it forces employers or people in positions of leadership to reassess what their biases and their kind of automated thinking when they are making these decisions. And ultimately, you will see a new appreciation of the merit people do bring to the table that is often overlooked without these schemes.
Okay, the woman in the second row. I'd ask you to be brief because we're almost reaching the break.
There's plenty of evidence to say that actually diverse boards and leadership teams actually produce greater wealth. And so in some ways it should be, if I was a CEO of an organisation, if I want to create more value, I want to have a more diverse team. But I'd like to follow up on both Roma's, your point. It's about a structure, the new mindset and shifting. And it's not just for women, it's for everyone. And I'm absolutely against quotas. I'm very much based on meritocracy. However, we women, especially on International Women's Day, should be helping up those from behind us. I've met this young lady here this evening. You know, we had a great chat and everything. And there's people like me who I'm successful in my career and everything. We should be taking these women with us and helping them and mentoring, because mentoring is a great way. And it also cuts across social divides and that, so we break those molds as well.
So, Liam Fox, sorry, we've got only a few moments left.
Well, to match our question, having worked for two female prime ministers, they would both have hated the idea that they were there because they were women rather than because they were the best. But I think we do have to accept that we have to ease the path so that women can actually take advantage of the talents that we have. And there was the lady in the second row asked a very interesting question earlier about how could we use trade to help some of those poorest. This is an International Women's Day. We should consider this, that one of the best ways that we can is to open up e-commerce to people, especially women. If you look at firms, those that are purely trading offline, 4 out of 5 are either owned or run by men. Those that are trading purely online, 4 out of 5 are either run or owned by women. There is a real opportunity to liberate women across the world by using e-commerce. And that's one of the things, in answer to your earlier question, that the government is actually championing.
We have, I'm sorry, there are hands up, and like on housing, I'd like to come to many more people, but our hour's done. We only have an hour. We should perhaps have fewer people on the panel, or perhaps we should have the whole audience just by themselves. We get better. Anyway, our hour's up for question time. Next Thursday, as I said earlier, we're going to be in Dover. We have the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU, Keir Starmer. We have the Irish MEP, Mairead McGuinness, and the actor Brian Cox among the 5 on the panel. The week after that, we're in Leeds, where our audience is all going to be under 30. Though it looks to me as if this audience is mostly under 30, but perhaps that's flattering some of you. The number to call, 0330 123 9988, if you'd like to be in those 2 places, or on the screen is the website. You can follow the instructions there. If you want to have your say on the topics we've been talking about, a reminder, you can join Adrian Childs on Question Time Extra Time. It's on 5 Live on BBC Now. If you want to watch it, you can push the red button, or you can watch it on iPlayer if you'd rather do that. So, my thanks to our panel and to all of you who came to this splendid setting of the Institution of Civil Engineers here in Westminster from Question Time. Until next Thursday, good night.
Well, stay with BBC One as Phil Jupiter puts grandstanding in the Spotlight section. This week follows in just a moment.